Veer Singh stood at the palace gates, watching the banners of his kingdom flutter against the evening sky. He had spent his entire life devoted to his duty as the commander of King Rudrapratap's army. Discipline, loyalty, and honor, these were the pillars of his existence. He was a warrior, forged in the fires of battle, his sword an extension of his will. And yet, that very sword trembled in his grip tonight. The king had summoned him with an order: invade the neighboring land of Sundarpur. It was a peaceful kingdom, untouched by war, ruled by a just and noble king. Veer had fought many battles, but never against a people who posed no threat. The thought of spilling innocent blood gnawed at him, but duty was duty. His oath bound him to the king, even when his heart rebelled against the command. "You hesitate," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Mira stood before him, her eyes searching his face. She had been his childhood friend, once filled with laughter, now a woman hardened by the realities of war. She was a healer, tending to the wounded, regardless of which side they fought for. "The king has spoken," Veer said, though the words felt hollow. "And what does your soul say?" she asked. He had no answer. From childhood, Guru Anand had taught him that Dharma, righteous duty, was above all. But was obedience to the king truly righteous, or was there a higher purpose? That night, Veer sat alone in the barracks, staring at the armor laid before him. He recalled his first battle, how he had fought with pride, believing he was upholding justice. But war had changed him. He had seen villages burned, families torn apart. He had convinced himself that it was necessary, that it was for the greater good. But for the first time, he questioned whether the greater good was just an illusion. At dawn, the army gathered at the border, ready to march. Veer mounted his horse, his face unreadable. As the drums signaled their advance, he tightened his grip on his sword. Ahead of him lay Sundarpur, a land of peace, soon to be drenched in blood. Behind him, the weight of duty pressed upon his shoulders. His horse took the first step forward, and with it, his soul whispered a single question: is this truly Dharma, or is this just blind loyalty? The battlefield was chaos. The air reeked of blood and smoke as swords clashed and arrows rained from the sky. Veer led his men into the heart of the fight, his movements precise, his blade cutting through the enemy ranks. Yet with every strike, his mind screamed at him. These were not warriors, they were farmers, blacksmiths, and scholars forced into war. A boy no older than 16 charged at him, fear evident in his trembling hands. Veer raised his sword but hesitated. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his grip unsteady. In that moment, Veer saw himself as a young soldier, eager to serve, unaware of the horrors ahead. His hand wavered, and in that single second of doubt, the boy swung his blade. Veer barely deflected the attack before another enemy soldier lunged at him. A sharp pain tore through his shoulder as steel met flesh. He stumbled back, gripping his wound, when a powerful force pulled him aside. General Vikram, his closest ally, had saved him. "Mercy is a weakness," Vikram said, his voice sharp. "Finish him, or he'll return with a blade to your throat." Veer looked at the boy again. He was frozen, waiting for death. But Veer couldn't bring himself to strike. With a swift move, he knocked the boy unconscious instead. Vikram's eyes narrowed. "You're questioning the king's orders," Vikram muttered. "That's dangerous." As the battle raged, Veer saw Mira among the wounded, tending to the fallen regardless of which side they fought for. Blood stained her hands, but her eyes held no fear, only determination. She worked tirelessly, refusing to see enemies, only suffering souls. Later that night, she found Veer sitting alone, staring at the blood on his hands. "You spared the boy," she said. "He was just a child," Veer whispered. "And how many more will die because of this war?" she asked. "How many families will be destroyed in the name of duty?" Veer had no answer. The war was not about defense or justice. It was conquest, fueled by the king's ambition. His whole life, he had believed his sword served righteousness. But was it truly righteous to fight for a cause he no longer believed in? His loyalty to the king had been absolute, but for the first time, he felt shackled by it. He had spent years fighting to protect the kingdom, but now, he wondered, who was protecting the innocent from the kingdom itself? The question unsettled him. That night, he stood outside the king's chambers, the weight of his armor pressing against his soul. He had always believed his path was clear. Now, he wasn't sure if he had been walking the right one at all. Veer entered the king's chamber, his steps firm, but his heart heavy. King Rudrapratap sat upon his throne, eyes sharp, sensing the defiance before a word was spoken. "This war is unjust," Veer said, his voice steady. "We are not defending our kingdom. We are destroying lives." The king's expression darkened. "Your duty is not to question, Veer. It is to obey." "I swore to protect this land, not conquer another for greed," Veer replied. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken threats. Then the king's voice turned cold. "You disappoint me." With a snap of his fingers, guards stepped forward. "You are no longer a commander. You are a traitor." Veer barely had time to react before General Vikram's sword was drawn. The betrayal was swift, ruthless. Vikram attacked without hesitation, his strikes brutal, each one aimed to kill. Veer blocked desperately, his injured shoulder burning with pain. He had fought alongside Vikram for years, trusted him like a brother. But loyalty to the throne ran deeper than friendship. Steel clashed, echoing through the chamber. Veer fought with everything he had, but the odds were against him. More guards flooded in. A blade slashed across his side, blood staining his armor. He staggered, knowing he couldn't win. With a final desperate move, he knocked Vikram off balance and leaped through the open window. The fall was hard, the impact jarring. Pain surged through his body, but he forced himself up and ran into the shadows. The city that once welcomed him now hunted him. Hours passed before he collapsed in a hidden alley, breath ragged. He was bleeding, exhausted, and alone. Then familiar hands lifted him, Mira. She had been waiting, as if she knew this moment would come. Without a word, she led him to safety. When Veer awoke, he was in the mountains, surrounded by a group of rebels, people who had suffered under the king's rule. Among them stood Guru Anant, his mentor, his face aged but his wisdom unchanged. "I have lost everything," Veer said. "You have lost nothing," Guru Anant replied. "You have finally seen the truth." Veer looked around. These people had no army, no power, only the will to fight for justice. He had once believed his sword was a tool of righteousness, but now he saw it had only been a weapon of a king. "You must decide," Guru Anant continued. "Will you fight for a throne? Or will you fight for those who have none?" Veer knew there was no turning back. He was no longer a commander. He was no longer a soldier of the king. He was something else now, something freer, something stronger. He was ready. Veer stood before the gathered rebels, his wounds still fresh, but his resolve unshaken. These were not soldiers, not warriors trained for battle. They were farmers, laborers, and healers who had been forced into resistance. Yet their eyes burned with the same fire he now carried. "The king's army is stronger," he said. "But strength is not in numbers. It is in purpose." They did not fight for land, gold, or power. They fought for their homes, their families, their right to live without fear. For the first time, Veer was fighting for something real. When the king's forces arrived, the battlefield was different. No banners, no grand formations, only the will of the oppressed standing against tyranny. Veer led them, not as a commander of war, but as a warrior of justice. The clash was brutal. The king's soldiers fought with discipline, but the rebels fought with desperation. Veer moved through the chaos, his blade striking with precision, no longer bound by blind loyalty. Then he saw Vikram. Their eyes met, and for a moment, nothing else existed. Vikram's sword was already raised, his face unreadable. "You should have stayed loyal," Vikram said, his voice almost regretful. "I am loyal," Veer replied, "just not to a king who values power over people." The battle between them was fierce, a test of everything they had once learned together. Steel met steel, each strike carrying the weight of their past. But Veer was no longer fighting to serve, he was fighting to free. That made all the difference. With a final, calculated move, Veer disarmed Vikram, sending his sword clattering to the ground. He had won. Vikram knelt, breathing heavily, waiting for the finishing blow. But it never came. "Kill me," Vikram demanded. "No," Veer said. "That's his way. Not mine." Vikram's gaze wavered, the certainty in his beliefs crumbling. For the first time, he saw Veer not as a traitor, but as a man who had chosen the right path. The battle raged around them, but the tide had turned. The people rose, their voices louder than the king's rule. When the palace gates fell, Rudrapratap's reign ended, not by a blade, but by the will of those he had oppressed. When victory was certain, the people looked to Veer. "The throne is yours," they said. But Veer shook his head. "A throne belongs to no man. Let the people govern themselves." He turned to Mira, to Guru Anant, to the faces of those he had fought for. They did not need a king. They needed freedom. As dawn broke over the land, Veer walked away, his sword sheathed. He had once believed duty was his purpose. Now he understood his purpose was to stand for what was right, not for those who demanded obedience. And in that, he had finally found true Dharma.